All right, so when people imagine a collapse, they think of the apocalypse, right? People running around in the streets, zombies, chainsaws, shotguns, but that's not usually what really happens. It's more of a gradual decline and a shift in world power, in currency, and how everyday life goes on. So we're going to break this down in terms of what happens when the U.S. collapses, because we're on the decline. If you don't read any sort of news headlines, economic data, currency cycles like I've posted in previous videos, then I would recommend reading up on that. But the triggers, what happens to trigger a collapse? Well, one of the main things could be a debt crisis. So when interest payments exceeds the overall tax revenue, then likely a default will happen. So right now the U.S. is paying around 25% of its revenue, tax revenue, directly to servicing the debt, meaning paying interest on the $38+ trillion owed. Okay, so when this exceeds, I guess technically 100%, then that would be the mark of an obvious crisis. Okay, so another trigger would be that the dollar reserve cracks. So the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and if a bunch of countries get together and say, no, we're not going to trade in U.S. dollar, we're going to trade in yuan or rupees or ruples or anything like that, right? That would signal a change in global monetary policy. And so maybe a major geopolitical setback occurs. For example, we could lose a war, or something massive happens like another global pandemic or something crazy, right? And so something else that definitely attributes to this would be a social breakdown. For example, up until the Biden era, people were wondering what exactly is a biological male versus biological female, and we had to have arguments and pass laws over that. Or it could be even deeper, okay? So political paralysis is also a contributing factor, where things get deadlocked and no new legislation can pass, or some sort of falling out or breakdown of the political system, okay? And so it's no real single moment. It's likely all of these things, or a contribution of too much debt, loss of trust, losing and being stretched thin in wars, and all these other things, okay? So it's important to note that collapse does not necessarily mean apocalypse, right? Collapse doesn't mean the entire world burns and, it's a nuclear fallout. It's probably more gradual and subtle, like you're noticing now, with prices going up, things getting more expensive. If you've heard the term enshittification, everything getting lower quality when you order electronics, food, consumer goods, and things like that, okay? So immediately after, what happens? Well, the markets will likely freeze. So maybe the New York Stock Exchange doesn't open up. You can't liquidate stocks, bonds, anything like that. We will see hyperinflation. So you go to your local 7-Eleven and, a Snickers bar that I'm a big fan of doesn't cost whatever it is, $3, it's $100, okay? And so, Treasury defaults will be part of this. Bonds become worthless. The U.S. dollar could plunge, likely 20 to 40% or more. Currency exchange rates reshuffle and things like that. And then, unemployment rates will spike because companies will lay off or collapse themselves. Their costs go up. They cannot pay their employees. Business slows or completely stops and they lay off. Okay. Something else that could happen would likely be capital control. So China has a lot of capital controls. The U.S. might say, oh, you're trying to leave the country with, a couple of gold bars and, $200,000 cash. No, you're not. Give us those, or you can't leave, or something like that, which already largely does exist, but it might be on a more extreme or localized level. Okay. Emergency legislation could pass. Just crazy laws can happen overnight, and things will change rapidly. So what happens to the U.S. dollar? Well, it'll likely lose reserve status. It won't be the reserve currency of the world. So that would mean oil would no longer be priced almost exclusively in U.S. dollars. We would likely see a change and obviously decline in the value of the dollar much faster than what we've seen, let's say, from COVID 2020 to now, with everyone thinking those price increases are insane. We'll wait until, prices change overnight, like in Weimar, Germany, when employees would get paid in wheelbarrows full of cash. They'd go to the bakery that same day to buy 2 loaves of bread with a wheelbarrow full of cash, because the next day it would be 2 wheelbarrows of cash for a couple of loaves of bread, right? And so maybe new reserve baskets will pop up. It might not just be one currency, it might be multiple, it could be digital, it could be physical, but likely another fiat currency will take its place, okay? And so inflation and volatility will be, the new normal for average America. So, a bag of rice might cost, $100 one day, $200 the next, and it might be back down to $100 the next day, and things will be crazy. And so, example would be the pound sterling when it lost its status after the war, and then things gradually shifted towards U.S. dollar. So we might see a single solid shift, like, for example, the Chinese yuan, with how much of an economic powerhouse they are, or it might be kind of a struggle period where things, the dust hasn't settled yet, okay? So, global powers start to shift. Likely winners would be China, because of their technology and their manufacturing capabilities. Every time you go to buy something on Amazon, even with some of these tariffs, the majority of products come from China, right? It could be India. They have a large population base. They have skilled workers. China and India have very similar populations, over 1 billion each. And so they might become a more dominant power, kind of taking up the space that was left in a vacuum from the United States. And so maybe BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they might start to have more power and control over trade routes, over currency, who trades in what currency. It could be more of those. And then there is a good potential for digital currencies to step up. So, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and even possibly CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, they might become more of the norm. And then, of course, physical precious metals are a huge one. If you've seen the run-up in gold and silver and palladium and platinum, and any of the precious metals, really, you've seen these kind of double or so in the last couple of years alone. And an interesting thing to note is that central banks are buying up, especially physical gold, in record numbers, because that is a kind of a red flag warning that they have lost confidence in U.S. dollars and global stability. Okay, so some of the losers would be Western Europe, U.S. allies, and any dollarized economies that primarily trade in U.S. dollars. So obviously the United States is a big one, and maybe Canada because they're so closely tied. And so all of these living conditions would get worse for the average person because their salaries, how they get paid, is likely in the local U.S. dollar currency, and then it inflates and costs much more just to survive on the same salary. And your salary does not inflate, unfortunately. We've seen that since the 80s, okay? So inside the U.S., day to day, what will some of these things look like? Well, you'll see cost increases on anything imported. So tech, consumer goods, some food, auto supplies, housing materials. A lot of these things are imported, and those costs would go up because you buy them in USD. They're traded and ordered from factories in bulk, wholesale, in US dollars, and all those costs would rapidly inflate. Okay, tech would increase. Software, financial services, hardware, anything computer related, right? With a lot of the chips for computing controlled from by China and other rare earth producers. Okay, so energy would go up, travel would go up, food obviously would increase, and the cost of medicine would also rapidly go up. And if you notice, all of those things are essentially essential day-to-day things that people use. And then obviously in here, housing as well will increase in cost. Okay, so more common would be localized economies, and so instead of buying from your supermarket, maybe it will be a Saturday morning kind of fair or market where people produce things locally and you trade or barter that way. Multiple currencies might pop up. So we exclusively use US dollars in the United States, but maybe you start to see pesos and pounds and euros and other things where people say, hey, look, these things have value and US dollars are declining. Maybe even some sort of bartering where people bring out their silver coins, or they say, hey, this is a nice pack of cigarettes, I'll trade you for that shirt, and that's how they'll settle transactions. Okay, so private security would likely ramp up where towns or cities are trying to keep law and order. You can't rely on the military. Maybe the police force disbands because they don't have funding. And then so it would be more community level type of government oversight rather than federal. Okay, so social and political restructuring. Let's look at this. The powers start shifting to states or local levels. So you're more likely to have new laws and enforcement passed by your town or city that you live in, and maybe state level or especially federal government oversight will shrink. So maybe the president or signs an executive order saying, all right, nobody leave their house, we're in a crisis. But then you look around, you say the power of the federal government is declining, I'm not going to pay attention to that because they can't enforce that, right? So wealth inequality will violently reset. People will start likely looting rich neighborhoods, stealing things from dealerships and supermarkets and Walmarts and things like that, because they're saying, hey, not necessarily the apocalypse here, but I need to eat, I need shelter, I need food, I need medicine, and I can't pay for it, so I'm going to do what I have to do, right? And then the housing market might restructure. Maybe people living in large complexes or other things where they can't pay their rent, but they don't want to leave, and so they'll stay put. And then who's going to enforce when millions of people default and can't pay rents and mortgages? The police who usually handle evictions, I know because I've evicted people, they can't go and evict 50 million people all in the same year, right? So that will be an interesting one. And then, a new elite class will start to form. So maybe more people rise in power locally, and then government politicians will sort of decrease in power, and you might see local warlords like in Mad Max or anything like that. So that would be interesting to see how that would play out in reality. But the global financial reset will then take place, and a new reserve currency will pop up. U.S. dollar will no longer be the reserve, and something else will take its place. We don't know what. New trade routes will form, how people ship via air, sea, train, anything like that. They might become more localized, more fragmented, more regional. You might not get things from, the Eastern Hemisphere, from overseas, and we might see more things come from, Mexico and South America or Canada and anything like that. So similarly, we would see fragmented allies, probably again more regional, where you're physically closer to some of these countries or states or even cities might form alliances and trading deals and things like that. And then digital currencies might take over settlements. So, people say that Bitcoin and crypto is secure and decentralized so it doesn't inflate. But then there's worries of manipulation, of, scams, of other things like that. But people might be desperate enough to say, hey, you have a Bitcoin, I have, this car. Can we come to a deal? I really need a car, right? That might be an overstretch or oversimplification, but it is a possibility, okay? Now, commodities will likely rise. So we see precious metals, as technically a commodity, going haywire, gold, silver spiking, maybe actual grains and foods and lumber and metal, and all these things will go up because, hey, I need to build a fence around my house to protect myself. I need to board my windows. I need to eat and then have 6 months of rice and beans stored up, and you're likely to pay more for that because, well, it becomes more of a necessity. And so, the U.S. influence will gradually shrink, and other countries and nations will take more precedence. But I want this to be clear that a collapse does not mean an end, right? It just means a transition. So if you're in the bottom half or lower third, this might actually be good for you because maybe, you have certain physical skills or abilities and that don't suit you in today's age, but you might be able to fare a lot better locally because you're not competing globally for your job and resources and things like that. You're competing locally, which is always easier, right? And so, empires collapse, but nations survive. We'll see new systems emerge, new ways of trading, doing business, living day to day. And people will adapt faster than the government. So if you're seeing any of this and you're thinking ahead, you might say, maybe I should start preparing. I should start buying precious metals. I should start investing in real estate. I should save more money. I should invest more in things that I own and control. So that way you're not taken off guard. So the end, it's not the end It's a new beginning of a new world order. Click the video appearing on your screen, and I'll see you in that next video.